Hey, Seraphin here. Cold fermentation is the simple process of letting your dough ferment in the fridge, a step said to improve your bread or pizza. So far, so good, right? However, beyond this basic concept, I'd argue that cold fermentation is widely misunderstood. A quick online search might lead you to believe that cold fermentation is synonymous with long fermentation, since nearly every recipe calls for at least 6 hours. If you don't have 6 to 72 hours to spare, you're unlikely to find any resources recommending cold fermentation. But what if there's a scientifically sound way to do it faster, say in just 3 hours, that still provides the benefits we're looking for, like improved flavor? To be honest, I've only recently discovered the full potential of this quick method myself. Cold fermentation is not only underrated, but also widely underutilized. Many people who could benefit from it don't even try to use it, assuming they need to wait for many hours. They're missing out simply because they don't know a shorter cold fermentation is even an option. What's more, even bakers who know how to use the technique properly often don't understand the real science of why it improves flavor. If you're a returning viewer to the channel, then you know this is exactly what we love to explore here, using bread science to find effective shortcuts to better bread. In this video, we'll tackle both of these misunderstandings head on. First, we'll explore the science of why cold fermentation improves flavor. Then, I'll show you how to get those benefits in just a few hours, with a method that fits any schedule. Let's get started. So let's start with a clear definition of both cold fermentation and the biggest misunderstandings around it. As a technique, cold fermentation sounds almost ridiculously simple. You just ferment your bread dough in the fridge, cooling it down to around 3 to 5 degrees Celsius. You might also hear about cold proofing, where a shaped dough is left to proof in the fridge, which is a very similar process. And while no one can claim to have invented cold fermentation, its rise to fame among home bakers started over 20 years ago. Popularized by books like The Bread Baker's Apprentice, which was released in 2001, cold fermentation, or retarding the dough, has been a popular baking method for at least 2 decades. In that book, the author Peter Reinhardt mentions learning it from a French baker whose baguette won the award for Best Baguette in Paris. Reinhardt's book wasn't the earliest to mention the method, though. An even older book from 1996 also details it. Both of these books present cold fermentation as a way to make bread taste phenomenally better. Reinhardt's book explains that this is because of enzymes that get to work when the yeast is slowed down. The enzymes he's talking about are tiny proteins that essentially cut up large gluten proteins and starch molecules. In Reinhardt's words, cold and slow fermentation was about allowing these enzymes to release flavor in the dough. The book was a massive success, reaching a huge audience of home bakers looking to elevate the taste of their bread and pizzas. However, while cold fermentation has become extremely popular since then, explanations of how it works haven't really caught up to the more recent research. In fact, in some cases, what cold fermentation actually does for our breads or pizzas has become even more shrouded in mystery. If you search for how cold fermentation works, the most popular explanation is still the one from early books like Reinhardt's, that the benefits are all because of slowing down the yeast to let enzymes create more flavor. The problem is that this isn't the full picture. While a lower temperature does slow down yeast, that's not the only thing it does. As you'll see, research shows cold fermentation can also reduce off flavors, increase positive aromas, and even improve bread volume and texture. But because of that older, incomplete explanation, the most popular one currently out there, most people think cold fermentation is pointless if you don't do it for a long time. I think this is a key part of the reason why cold fermentation became essentially synonymous with long fermentation. As I mentioned, you'll find practically no recipes for a short cold ferment and absolutely none that suggest adding more yeast to speed it up in the fridge. It's almost like the idea itself has been cut off in the cradle. And this explanation also gives the overall impression that the longer the bread making process takes, the better the bread must be, which is true to a certain extent, but as a more extreme result of this way of thinking, some people use tiny, absolutely minuscule amounts of instant yeast to try to really extend the cold fermentation. This results in a big issue that I've actually talked about before, and it's landed me some heated comments. To reiterate it, let me just say this. Cold fermentation, or any long fermentation where you don't have enough yeast, is generally a bad idea. To explain why, I'll use an analogy I've mentioned before. If you've had a delicious lunch or dinner, why not have 10 more portions in the same sitting? The problem should be obvious. There's a limit to how much you can eat, and the same thing applies to baker's yeast. If you give them a mountain of food, you can't expect them to polish it all off in a short amount of time, no matter how good they are at reproducing. That leftover unfermented dough provides nutrients and a suitable environment for other microorganisms to grow, good or bad alike. While the cold does slow them down, fridges aren't always perfectly calibrated, and they can be filled to the brim with other foods. Although traditionally long fermentation has been done in pizzas and bread making, many recipes have other elements that could prevent microbial activity, such as a high level of salt or the use of a sourdough starter. And as for flavor, we'll see in a bit that there's also a good reason why using way too little yeast can result in the creation of more off flavors. So ultimately, I don't recommend cold fermentation with a very small amount of yeast, at least not with that method. Fortunately, there are better ways to develop flavor, like using a sourdough starter, fruit yeast water, or a pre-ferment, all of which ensure a healthy proportion of yeast to dough. I've talked about these other aspects before, and in today's video, I'm going to show you how we can do cold fermentation properly to maximize the benefits we get from it. But before we get into how cold fermentation works to improve bread and its flavor, we need to know why bread tastes the way it does in the first place. Aside from ingredients like salt and sugar that directly hit our taste buds, the flavor of bread is heavily influenced by smell. It's often said that between 75 to 95% of taste is smell, and while that number is likely unfounded, most would agree that scent plays a dominant role. So then what makes bread smell like bread then? Well, bread can have over 500 different volatile compounds, which sounds impressive, but only a few significantly contribute to what we actually smell. A lot of the scents pretty much go undetected by us, and so they don't really affect what we actually smell. Of course, some people might be more sensitive to the bread's aroma, just like how some wine connoisseurs are better able to tell apart different wines. But ultimately, it doesn't change the fact that some scents will always be more influential than others. And to measure which ones matter most, scientists use a metric called odor activity value. Think of it like this. A compound with a high odor activity value is kind of like the lead singer of a band. Its voice is the one you hear the most clearly, even if other band members are playing just as loud. This is why compounds with high odor activity values are key odorants that define the bread's flavor. For instance, this compound, which smells like popcorn, is the primary odorant of the crust due to its high odor activity value. So it plays a significant role in the scent of our bread, even if its concentration is lower than other compounds. As for the bread crumb, compounds like these have been identified as having some of the highest odor activity values. And it's interesting to note that a lot of them don't seem to smell particularly bread-like. But where do these key aromas come from, and how does cold fermentation affect them? Well, bread is divided into two zones, the crust and the crumb. For the bread crust, aroma compounds are predominantly formed from thermal reactions that occur during baking, especially Maillard reactions. As for the bread crumb, most aroma compounds originate from the metabolism of the yeast during fermentation and a process called lipid oxidation. Generally, we like many of the aroma compounds coming from yeast fermentation, which includes sweet and fruity smelling esters, along with malty, honey, and butter-like aroma compounds. On the other hand, lipid oxidation often results in unpleasant or off aromas, with some being described as rancid, fatty, and green. And we probably have good reason to dislike these scents. In the 1970s, when scientists looked at staling bread, they found that as it was stored, its aroma significantly changed for the worse, likely due to the loss of good-smelling volatile compounds and the increase of off flavors from lipid oxidation. It's also worth noting that lipid oxidation may also influence the difference in taste between industrially made bread and artisan or homemade bread. So if you don't like the taste of industrial bread and much prefer homemade or artisan alternatives, you could be picking up on these notes. Of course, lipid oxidation may not be entirely bad. One Chinese study looking at the effects of kneading on the aroma of steamed bread actually recommended a more intensive process to bring out more lipid oxidation products, stating that it resulted in a better aroma. To add some more nuance, some aroma compounds made by lipid oxidation are considered positive aromas. So to a certain extent, some lipid oxidation is probably okay or even a good thing. And depending on your personal preference, the aroma and taste of what you consider a good loaf of bread could vary. With that being said, for the rest of this video, following what the scientific papers suggest, we're going to mostly consider lipid oxidation as a source of undesirable flavors. And this is where cold fermentation has its first major impact. In this study, researchers found that higher fermentation temperatures, such as 15 degrees and 35 degrees Celsius, led to an increased formation of most lipid oxidation compounds in the breadcrumb, notably hexanol and heptanol. These compounds are not typically considered positive aromas, and to make things worse, they have a pretty high odor activity value, making them quite influential in terms of scent. However, fermentation at 5 degrees Celsius resulted in less of these lipid oxidation products, which probably means less of an off flavor in cold fermented bread. This is because the rate of lipid oxidation speeds up at higher temperatures, and this affects the aroma of the crust too. Ultimately, this is the key to why even shorter cold fermentation periods can be beneficial to bread flavor. Even in a 2 to 3 hour cold ferment, you can benefit from cold fermentation simply by preventing lipid oxidation. And to make sure that the bread dough rises within that time, you can speed up the fermentation by adding some more yeast. In fact, in this study, that's basically what the researchers recommended: a low fermentation temperature and a high concentration of yeast. Specifically, the paper recommended cold fermentation at 5 degrees Celsius and the use of 60 grams of fresh pressed yeast per kilogram of flour, which is around 6% of fresh yeast, baker's percentage, or 2% of instant yeast. So, for example, for a bread dough with 300 grams of flour, that would be 18 grams of fresh yeast or about 6 grams of instant yeast. According to the paper, the dough took around 3 hours to rise to the desired height with this much yeast, although your exact timing would vary depending on various things such as yeast condition and dough hydration. A quick tip here is that you don't have to add all this yeast in one go. What I like to do is make a pre-ferment with some of the yeast and then add a little more yeast in the bread dough later on, which allows me to get more flavor and gives me some more leeway. This way I can adjust the amount of yeast I add to the dough, allowing me to fully control the timing of the cold fermentation. If I've got more time than expected, then I can just use less yeast and cold ferment for longer. Naturally, if you're looking for the ultimate best flavor, then a longer cold fermentation will absolutely be more beneficial. But sometimes we just want to have bread within a few hours, and this is a simple step to make it better. Now, you might wonder though, is using more yeast to speed up the cold fermentation going to adversely affect the flavor? Well, as written in this paper, although there were 2 compounds that went up when yeast levels were increased, overall, the levels of the majority of lipid oxidation products were independent of yeast concentration. With that being said, when you increase the amount of yeast added, you should know that other important and pleasant aroma compounds also increase in amount. So there's a bit of a give and take here. And as we'll see in a second, cold fermentation also influences yeast metabolic products, which could lead to an even better flavor. To continue this discussion about lipid oxidation, I think it's also important to know that lipid oxidation products can also be increased when you knead the dough for longer, which is actually very common in a lot of recipes that ferment their bread dough for a shorter period of time. So if you're making bread dough in the stand mixer or have to knead it extensively to full gluten development, then you probably already have more of these lipid oxidation products. So if you think about it, in a way, it might be even more important for you to cold ferment bread dough that's been mixed or kneaded intensively, given that it already has more lipid oxidation products. And you should also know that with too little yeast, we can also end up with more lipid oxidation. A study found that in wheat flour dough made with inactivated yeast, the main flavor contributing process was lipid oxidation. The paper suggested that without the yeast to take up the oxygen, lipid oxidation ran basically unchecked. So I'd say that it makes sense to speculate that if you don't use enough yeast, you could actually be harming the flavor of your bread in one aspect. Ultimately, the takeaway here is that cold fermentation is beneficial for both short and long periods of time, as long as you make sure you've got the right proportion of yeast. Now, beyond just preventing bad flavors, cold fermentation also helps create good ones. The same study we mentioned before found that low fermentation temperatures increase the formation of esters like ethyl acetate, ethyl hexanoate, and ethyl octanoate. Although their odor activity values can be low, these esters are of interest because they are generally characterized by pleasant, fruity, and sweet odors. Now, cold fermentation isn't just used for bread. It's a big deal in the wine world too. Winemakers often use low temperatures to improve flavor, especially in white and rosé wines. What's fascinating is that this probably isn't a new idea at all. The existence of wine cellars from thousands of years ago shows that winemakers likely knew the importance of temperature for flavor. And today, science is finally catching up to explain the whole story behind how this works. Esters are primarily formed through yeast metabolism, and the reason for why cold fermentation results in more of these esters probably has something to do with acids. It's assumed that colder fermentation temperatures lead to a higher concentration of acids in the bread crumb. This is important to esters because these acids are precursors to their creation. One of the esters we mentioned, ethyl acetate for instance, is formed by the combination of acetic acid with ethanol in a process called esterification. And ethyl octanoate is formed from caprylic acid and ethanol. Some esters are also linked to increased yeast concentrations, so adding more yeast might benefit bread flavor by increasing the amount of these esters. Additionally, another study found that long fermentation at low temperatures in yeast bread could promote the formation of ethanol and higher molecular weight alcohols like 3-methylbutanol and phenylethanol. Although it's important to note that these compounds are probably affected by several other factors like the amount of yeast, total fermentation time, and how much food the yeast has. In the case of sourdough, although we won't go too deeply into it, you'll often hear that cold fermentation leads to a more acidic bread, which is probably true as long as you ferment the bread dough for long enough. You see, lower temperatures generally slow down the metabolic activity and growth of both yeast and lactic acid bacteria in sourdough. This means that the rate at which acids are produced is reduced. But while the rate of acidification is slower at low temperatures, a long fermentation, often performed at low temperatures, can lead to a higher accumulation of acids in the final breadcrumb. This is because the extended duration allows for a greater overall amount of acid to be produced, compensating for the slower rate. This long, low-temperature fermentation leads to more acids in the crumb, which is probably what people mean when they say cold fermentation makes the bread more acidic. Cold fermentation coupled with a longer overall fermentation time also probably leads to more volatile compounds being produced in the sourdough bread. But exactly which volatile compounds can depend on the strain of lactic acid bacteria inside your sourdough. Now, outside of the crumb, cold fermentation also affects the crust aroma. But the impact of fermentation temperature on Maillard reaction aromas varies with bread type. In yeast bread, long fermentation at low temperatures can limit the formation of Maillard reaction aromas in the crust. However, in sourdough bread, long fermentation at low temperatures promotes both the Maillard reaction and aromas derived from lactic acid bacteria metabolism. With that being said, for yeast bread, longer fermentation times with subsequent low temperature fermentation has been shown to increase the amount of Strecker aldehydes in the bread crust, which impart pleasant, malty notes to bread. This is likely due to extended proteolysis, which generates more amino acids that serve as precursors for these compounds. Now, one thing you'll often hear about cold fermentation is that it allows bread to rise better in the oven, but the science is a bit more nuanced. There isn't a study exactly showing that cold fermentation by itself leads to more volume. In fact, one study found that white bread volume increased with higher yeast dose, fermentation time, and temperature. This could be because within a set amount of time, yeast activity, which produces carbon dioxide gas for leavening, increases as temperature rises. However, if you mix your bread at a lower temperature and then cold ferment it, you could end up with more volume and a better texture. For example, one study showed that breads made from dough mixed and bulk fermented at 17 degrees Celsius showed the highest bread volume and specific loaf volume, outperforming those at 23 degrees Celsius and 30 degrees Celsius. This is probably in part because mixing at colder temperatures results in an improved gluten network due to more hydrogen bonds. It's also said to give you a dough that's less sticky, which can be important for dough handling. So if you want more volume and fluffier bread, then it's probably a good idea to mix or knead the dough for longer at a lower temperature. It may also be a good idea to bulk ferment in the fridge and proof the dough at a warmer room temperature, as was done in the paper, or to increase the amount of yeast and extend the fermentation of a retarded dough. This should ultimately allow us to have a colder, less sticky dough that yields bread with an improved texture and volume compared to warmer mixing conditions. Okay, we've covered the science of cold fermentation and how to best use it. So let's bring it all together. First, cold fermentation isn't an all-or-nothing game. Even a short 2 to 3 hour cold ferment in the fridge can improve your bread's flavor, mainly by preventing the formation of undesirable off flavors from lipid oxidation. Second, cold fermentation is also fantastic for developing positive flavors, like the fruity esters and complex alcohols that give artisan bread its character. Although you would probably need to ferment the bread dough for longer or add more yeast to get more of these aroma compounds. Finally, how you cold ferment matters. Using enough yeast is crucial for both flavor and food safety. To get even more flavor, consider using sourdough, fruit yeast water, or pre-ferments. And if you make sure to mix the dough at a lower temperature as well, perhaps using cold water, then you could also get the benefits of better volume and texture. The key takeaway here is that cold fermentation is a flexible tool. You can adapt it to fit your schedule and the type of bread you want to make. Don't be afraid to experiment, try a short cold ferment on your next quick white pan loaf, or use a combination of a cold bulk fermentation and a warm proofing to get the best of both worlds in terms of flavor and volume. And as previously discussed, if you want to limit the amount of yeast used, a pre-ferment is an excellent alternative. You can develop this through a long, cold overnight fermentation. Careful calculation will guide your decision on whether to incorporate additional yeast into the final dough or not. Previously, my most effective approach for maximizing flavor was to use a pre-ferment with room temperature bulk fermentation and proofing, omitting any additional yeast in the final dough. However, after revisiting the science and experimenting with cold fermentation, I've discovered the benefits of retarding the final dough as well. This quick technique gives me another valuable option for developing flavor, particularly when using a bit more yeast to manage the cold fermentation. That said, taste is subjective. You may prefer the flavors developed during room temperature fermentation, which often creates a more intense crust flavor. While I enjoy the softer, subtly fruity notes from cold fermentation, you might prefer the bolder flavors that develop at room temperature. So I encourage you to experiment with different combinations of these methods to find what you like best. As we end this video, I hope that we've demystified cold fermentation and given you the confidence to use it on your terms. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and let us know in the comments what experiences you've had with cold fermentation. And that's it for this video. Thanks for watching and bye!